us have seen Jews as being double citizens and having double citizenship, dual citizenship with Israel, which of course is not true, but that's been put out too. And type stuff has gone on for years. And as Professor Wiesel said, people who hate everyone. And I'd now like to yield to Ms. Fischbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just have a quick, I guess maybe not quick, a question for Mr. Fa. And I was just wondering, you know, in your work fighting discrimination in the education admissions process, do you find that this type of discrimination to be across all types of schools, like public, private, regional, religious, non-religious? I guess I'm just kind of wondering if there's a pattern or a general trend that you observe in the kinds of schools, the types of schools that are having issue.
Well, certainly, thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. Certainly, this type of discrimination happens at different types of schools. The Harvard case obviously considers a private school that receives federal funding, so that's a lawsuit based on Title VI. The work that we do at Pacific Legal Foundation really focuses on the Equal Protection Clause, and the defendants in those cases are government entities and public schools. And we see that throughout the country. We've fought discrimination in places like New York, places like Virginia, places like Maryland, and we fought racial quotas representing not just Asian American families across the United States, but also Black and Hispanic families who are being denied educational opportunities on the basis of race. So this is a prevalent issue in America, sadly, today, but we look forward to enforcing our clients' rights under the Equal Protection Clause and their right to equality before the law.
And Mr. Fa, maybe just kind of a follow-up, you know, there are some schools that certainly do better at not discriminating, and if you found that, you know, are there some characteristics about those schools that they share that the others don't have? Have you found anything to that about that?
Sure. So many of those schools are where we have litigated are the admissions system, at least previously, had been governed by an objective test that anybody can take. That is, you know, and your chances of getting into those specialized schools or magnet schools were determined by your score on the test. The highest scores on the test would get in, no matter what their race or ethnicity. But unfortunately, local government in places like New York, Montgomery County, Thomas, and Virginia have found the results to be the schools have had too many Asians, in their opinion. So they've changed the admissions policies in cases to discriminate against Asian American students, and in the case of our New York clients, low-income Asian American students, only because there were too many, in their view, too many Asian Americans at those schools.
Thank you, Mr. Fine. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Fischbach. And as terrible as that all is, when my father went to medical school, many of those medical schools did not accept Jews at all. I now recognize Ms. Ross.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this very important hearing during this very important and sad week. I want to thank everyone on the panel for being here. I want to let you know that my district in North Carolina is home to a large and vibrant Asian American community. These individuals, whether they were born here or came to North Carolina as immigrants, are an essential part of the Research Triangle's workforce and community. Wake County would not be the hub of innovation and culture that it is without their contribution.
With that objection, we'll be done.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, several of my constituents of Asian descent have reported racist incidents. One Chinese constituent was labeled a communist in a disparaging newspaper article. A college student found her Chinese New Year display in her dorm destroyed. Others have been verbally harassed to the extent that they worry about their safety in public. Unfortunately, this is not the first time in our nation's history that our Asian Americans have found themselves subject to discrimination, as we've heard today. This stems directly from xenophobic federal policies. Earlier, we heard Representative Matsui testify about the impact of living in an internment camp on her family. I would like to address my first question to Professor Motomura. I know that we've talked about anti-Asian laws and how they've contributed to our society. Could you give us examples of when anti-Asian laws have been repealed and how public sentiment has come to allow for that repeal?
Well, though there are several examples, but one is that, as I mentioned in testimony, the Chinese exclusion laws were in place from the 1870s until 1943. And I think that one of the influences that resulted in the repeal of Chinese exclusion was the allyship between the United States and China in World War II. So there were other events that came in. I'm not sure there was a particular change of heart with regard to Chinese American community, but there was at that time, and Professor Lee might be able to speak more to this, but there's much more of a change of attitude trying to distinguish. There was a pursuing a time to distinguish Chinese on foreign policy and more related reasons from Japanese Americans. And so in some sense, you could look at this as a change of heart with regard to Chinese Americans, but you could also look at it as an attempt to demonize the Japanese Americans. So this was in 1943. So that would be one example. And also in 1965, of course, and this is a very long history, and you probably don't want me to get into it on your time, but but in 1965, of course, you have the end of the National Origins Act, and that too is a racially restrictive scheme that was in place from 1921 until 1965, and so a lot of influences. That was really part of the civil rights movement to end this scheme that had restricted by race until 1965. So we've had these incidents, and we've had examples of this.
Thank you very much. And then just to follow up, are there examples of current or more recent immigration policies that have impacted Asian Americans and their families, even if perhaps they were not the targeted demographic? We're taking up immigration bills this week, and I think that would be an important thing to know.
Yeah, well, I think that there are different aspects of this. Some of this has to do with the inability of the American immigration system to fully accommodate the needs of the American economy with regard to workers. And so you have bills in place right now that would essentially grant legal immigration status to a number of workers, many of whom are essential workers, many of whom are from Asia. That would be one example of this. I think that there are restrictions right now that limit the ability of Asian immigrants to come to this country. But I think this is also a pattern, and the patterns that I was trying to describe earlier, they relate to all different sorts of ethnic groups. I think a much more concerning piece of this, or an equally concerning piece of this, is, as I mentioned in testimony, the treatment of Latino immigrants and the inability of Latino immigrants to acquire lawful immigration status. So that would be another one that I think is actually demographically highly significant as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Next, I'll recognize Mr. Henry Hank Calvin Johnson.
I thank the chairman for hosting this very timely hearing. And I would like to ask unanimous consent to submit a 31-second video produced by the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta organization regarding violence against members of the AAIP community, along with a letter asking for a community-based response to the violence in Atlanta, which is dated March 18th, 2021, and is signed by multiple Asian American community groups in my district. For the record,
Unanimous consent is granted. Ms. Garcia, Ms. Ross, it's unanimous.
thank you. Mr. Chairman, my heart cries tears of sorrow and solidarity with the families of those killed in Tuesday's mass murder in Atlanta. With all the are left with feelings of terror of what might happen next to them, their families, their AIP friends. Whether the massacre in Atlanta was sex-based or race-based, it was hate-based and directed at Asian women, no question about it. If genocide against Native Americans and slavery are our nation's original sin, then harassment and violence against Asian Americans is its progeny. As Georgia State Senator Michelle Au presciently said on Monday, this recent violence against Asian Americans is a new chapter in a very old story. The correlation between the rise of xenophobic and racist rhetoric by President Trump and his Republican Party supporters and the dramatic and alarming rise in violence against Asian Americans is not coincidental. It is an unfortunate and calculated result, which is open season on Asian Americans in this country. And when folks on this committee talk about CHICOMs, what they're doing is they're using they're using stereotypes against any people, and I resent it. As a Black man in America, I understand what it's like to be targeted because of how you look. I understand how terrible it is to be viewed by your fellow citizens as other in a nation that prides itself supposedly on being the melting pot of the world. America, it's time to admit that we have a problem. It's time to take affirmative action to correct that problem. And I look forward to a time where we can banish hate and replace it with love in this country. And with that, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Yang, about the fact that healthcare workers have specifically suffered disproportionately during the pandemic. How have Asian American healthcare workers been impacted by discrimination and violence over the last year, particularly those involved in the healthcare industry specifically?
Thank you very much for that question. And thank you first for lifting up the work that is being done in Atlanta by our community groups there, because that is vital, it is important. And with respect to the healthcare workers in particular, those are the essential frontline workers that we talk about, the people that are putting their health at risk to serve our entire country, not just Asian Americans, but to serve our entire country. And both Ms. Karkarni as well as myself, when we look at the incidents that we have coming in, we could cite to so many examples of healthcare workers getting shunned, getting spit, getting coughed on, or statements saying that we don't want them to treat us. And so it has had both a mental toll as well as in some cases a physical toll. If I might, I do want to go back to one other piece with respect to the community-based response that we're talking about, which is public safety is not the same thing as law enforcement. Yes, we absolutely need public safety, but we can reimagine it in a way that we're not putting sole reliance on law enforcement when we don't, oftentimes our communities don't trust that vehicle. Thank you.
Thank you. This hearing is not about defunding the police either. And does violence and how does violence and discrimination affect the mental health of members of the AAIP community collectively?
If the question is directed to me, it's clear. It affects our entire community. If you ask any of your Asian American friends right now, they will say that this is on their minds. And so one thing I would urge people to do in this moment is to reach out to your friends, reach out to your community, and make sure that they feel seen, they feel heard, and they feel protected.
Thank you. Mr. Kim, has the government provided enough support to Asian American healthcare workers? And what role do you see Congress playing in addressing these concerns and providing more support to Asian American healthcare and other frontline workers?
Well, thank you for the question. I think, as it pertains to healthcare workers, the thing that I find most anecdotally is that many of them are experiencing bigotry and hate, even as they're trying to help people fighting this virus. I think the ways that we can support them as friends and members of our community is some of the ways that we have. We've seen people, play music for them at 7 o'clock and clap for them. But the ways that our government can help is really just to support the community at large. And I think those frontline workers are also members of the AAPI community. They may be at work helping people, but they go home and they're scared to go home the same way the rest of us are. And so I encourage us all to think about the frontline workers as part of the larger community. And these two bills that are before the committee right now will help all AAPIs.
Thank you, Professor Kulkarni. What is the correlation between the rhetoric of the Trump administration and the rise in violence against AAIPs?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. We know from a study that we did, excuse me, in the fall that actually over 700 of the incidents reported to stop AAPI hate of the 2,500 we had received at that point actually correlated to comments that were made about China as the China virus, the Wuhan virus, and Kung flu, and similar comments that were made about sending people back to their country. So we know that, in fact, comments like that have absolutely resulted in hate incidents being perpetrated against our community members. And we know that because the data shows it. And if I may add to that, just in terms of some of the resources that can be provided, I think local communities, as you have pointed out, could very much benefit from added funding and an infrastructure to provide support for our community members.
Thank you. I want to make it clear that it's not just white folks who are acting against AAIPs, it's other communities, including Black people. And I want to issue a challenge to all communities to be aware of the fact that our brothers and sisters in the AAIP community are particularly targeted right now, and we need to embrace them with love and not contribute to the hate that is enveloping them. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Now I recognize the lady from Houston, Texas.
Thank you,
Sylvia
Mr.
Garcia.
Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses, especially my colleagues, for sharing their very, very personal stories. At a time when we should be working together, helping one another as Americans to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've all witnessed the Asian American community, like Latinos and other communities, that are facing an alarming rise in violence, hate, and discrimination. It is inherently un-American for anyone to discriminate and launch vicious hate crimes against an Asian American. Too often, immigrants have been blamed and scapegoated or harassed, telling them to go back to their country. I know I've been told to go back to Mexico. If we can play a quick video clip, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, ma'am. Play the video.
Out of this world, get the out of this state, go back to whatever Asian country you belong in.
go back to blank Asian country that you belong. Many of us have heard that. And this is just one example of the various types of discrimination and harassment that Asian Americans, Latinos, and others face too often in our country. This does not represent who we are as a nation. As President Biden has said, violence against Asian Americans is un-American and it must stop. And Mr. Kim, I know that you also added that we need to look at this as a humanity issue because humanity matters. And the last time you were before this committee, you also told us that what is in the media, visually, in print, everywhere, also matters. I wanted to ask you specifically about the rhetoric coming from politicians, as some of you have testified. I know we have focused on the former president, but Senator Cornyn of Texas said, China is to blame because a culture where people eat bats and snakes and dogs and things like that. China has been the source of a lot of these viruses like SARS, like MERS, the swine flu, and now the coronavirus. Senator Cruz, also from Texas, said that Trump was not worried because he wasn't serving bat soup in Hunan province. An apparent nod to the now debunked myth that the outbreak started in Hunan. How do these words and all the coverage that all this gets in print and sometimes in the news visually, how does that impact hate crimes, hate incidents in this country? Are you unmuted, sir? Mr. Kim.
Thank you for that question, Representative. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
First of all, I want to thank you for showing that clip of the woman in Torrance, California. That happens to be the neighborhood where my brother and his family live. And that woman is Latina, which highlights the point that you were trying to make that this is not just an issue of white people versus Asian people or black people versus Asian people. It is really a question of everybody versus acts of hate and bigotry. And that I think really needs to be highlighted because this is not part just of the Asian American history, it's part of the history of America. Now, to your question, I will say that yes, it matters that other representatives other than the president have been using these terms of hate and connecting Americans to a virus that they have no connection to whatsoever. It is part of our leadership. And, I think I'm an idealist because I still do believe in the words of my leaders. I want to believe that they are setting the tone for the rest of the country. And that when they use rhetoric like this, it not only affects adults, but it affects our children. It's a shameful thing to have to say. Don't listen to what your president is saying. Don't listen to what your senator is saying. If you cannot teach your children the same things that you would ask of your leaders, then what example are we setting? And the way it becomes insidious in our culture is that this language permeates through to places like Jay Baker, the spokesman for the sheriff's office in Cherokee County, who actually tweeted out T-shirts making fun of coronavirus and connecting it to China. This is a person who has a direct connection to the shooter of 8 people. He is not impartial, and so it calls into question, the veracity of his position. And so these are all ways in which it's connected, and words matter from our president, from our leaders, for anyone with a platform, which is why I'm here today to ask those of you who are leading us to speak out for us instead of encouraging hate.
Thank you for that answer. And I think, what our children and all Americans see in the news or hear or read in the paper matters, because words do matter. And as you said, humanity matters. So thank you for the response. Mr. Chairman, I want to introduce the articles that I've referenced together with other articles, which unfortunately the rhetoric is building and the coverage is building. So I'd like to introduce these into the record. I ask for unanimous consent.
So done, without objection.
And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. And I believe we have Ms. Bush with us. And Ms. Bush, the honorable congressperson from St. Louis, Missouri, up the river, is recognized. You have to unmute though, Ms. Bush. Unmute.
All right,
There you go.
all right, I'm here. Thank you. In St. Louis and I, again, thank you, Chairman, for convening this hearing. I want to extend my deepest condolences to the AAPI community, many of whom have lost loved ones, been victims of white supremacist hate crimes, or in some way have been victimized by the horrific incidents of this past year. My heart is with you. There are more than, and it's been said before over and over again, 3,000 hate crimes reported over the last year as a result of anti-Asian American racism. That 3,000 number, it's horrific, and I don't want to just gloss over. It's 3,000 incidents. The rise of hate crimes against Asian Americans is inherently tied to anti-Asian American rhetoric, some of which has come out of this very chamber. Rhetoric, which we have been told even on this this hearing today, that words don't matter, that we shouldn't be worried about words, but especially when people from a place of privilege speak about that, what can directly lead to physical harm, you have to own that. You have to own it causes harm. It causes harm to people, especially people of color. And so to call it out as if it does not matter, it does, because we're talking about lives at stake. This is a refusal of responsibility, and I'm going to call it out. And this is not a partisan thing. Last week, we held a hearing about member conduct and the need to engage from a place of respect, how we conduct ourselves as leaders, what we say, and who we engage with. That has a direct impact on what happens in our streets. It is our words. And it's why our words and our actions as leaders are so important. Leading from a place of hate only fuels hateful and violent acts across our country. Leading with love starts with what we say, the words we use, and the meaning behind them. Words can build up communities or break them down. What we've witnessed over the last 4 years is hateful white supremacist rhetoric. While I cannot speak on behalf of the AAPI community, I do want to say that I stand in solidarity with you. So organize, galvanize, and get justice. Fight against white supremacy with us. 2 nights ago, for the 6 Asian women who tragically lost their lives as a result of racist sentiments, racist rhetoric, and racist policies. It's not lost on me that we lost women, working women. In fact, a majority of anti-Asian hate crimes are committed against Asian women, and you all have said that over and over again today, but as a Black woman, I want to speak that point. So Professor Lee, are there reports or experiences that have particularly impacted you on an emotional level? Have you had increased fear for your own safety? I want to bring the humanity into this a little bit more.
Thank you so much for asking. Thank you for those powerful words of solidarity. I think all of our communities really appreciate it. I am an educator. I'm also a researcher and writer, but my real day job is to get in the classroom, or in this case, during the pandemic, just here through Zoom. And my students are traumatized. Our communities are traumatized. What this brings up is lifetimes, histories, family histories of trauma. Trauma that perhaps some of our families thought was over and done with because, as Mr. Yang pointed out, the popular media image is that Asian Americans have made it and everything is okay. What the pandemic has revealed is the stark truth that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders remain victims of the similar types of white supremacy that has infected our country for so long. So we have people who are afraid to go about their neighborhoods, to do their daily businesses, but we also have an outpouring of new resilience, I believe, a wake-up call, as Daniel J. Kim mentioned, a reminder that we have been here before, that we have acted out, we have organized, we have sought justice in solidarity with others, and that we'll continue to do so.
Thank you. Mr. Yang, in addition to potential legislation, what are there community actions being successfully taken to combat this anti-Asian American violence and harassment? And how best can the government support these efforts, the federal government?
Thank you very much for that question. Thank you for the solidarity. Absolutely, the federal government can do more in terms of appropriations to make sure that these community organizations have the resources that they need, whether it is through grants through the Office of Justice Programs at DOJ, ensuring that there's language access, ensuring that there's multilingual capacities, there's budget items for that. Those are some of the small pieces that the federal government can do. Certainly the COVID-19 hate crimes bill from Representative Mang and Senator Hirono is another piece to that, along with the Jawahir Hire No Hate Act. I apologize, but I do need to go to one prior statement that Representative Garcia made about statements by senators. One report that we received on our website, Tracking Hate, this person reported, my dad and I were stopped at a red light when my dad noticed a man on the sidewalk. That man came up to me, called me a female, so I'm not going to use the word, a few times, and then threatened to kick our teeth in. He did this while calling us disgusting mother effers and telling us we need to stop eating bats and bringing diseases over here. So yes, words matter. Words of our leaders matter. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And Mr. Chair, I ask consent to enter into the record a document from the Asian American table that details the kinds of programming that are crucial in this moment.
Without objection, shall be done.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bush. And now I recognize I shouldn't say the other lady, the first lady from Houston, Texas, home of Archie Bell and the Drells, where they not only sing, but they dance, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee.
Chairman, thank you so very much. Let me very quickly say that all of us went into a extensive moment of mourning for the loss of those women and men and others in the killings in Atlanta. But we cannot ignore, we cannot be unsisterly and unbrotherly like to not notice the fact that they were innocent and 6 were Asian women. Asian Americans, our sisters, we will not ignore. I would like to have a video shown right now.
We just, how to say, stuck my face with a knife.
After the slash, the father of 3 says the attacker ran off. But as Bowie went for help, the 19-year-old suspect came back.
He just focused to my son was just stuck. He said, but I'm trying to save them. And suddenly I ran to them and pulled the car, but I cannot, it's a little bit late.
A 3-year-old baby cut, a father cut. The assailant did this heinous act. Are we live? The assailant did this heinous act because he thought the family was Chinese and infecting people with the coronavirus. He thought the family was Chinese and they were infecting people with the coronavirus. Take your heads out of the sand. Where is the dignity? Where is the power of the respect for all people and the love of Americans? And so as we look at the outrage, let me put into the record, the 45th president always referring to coronavirus as a China virus or Kung Fu. Let me call his name, President Trump. Let me also say in 1942, and I'm glad Congressman Matsui mentioned it, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signing Executive Order 9066, which ordered the forced internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. Innocent, patriotic Americans. In 1982, amid a downturn in the U.S. automobile industry, the competition was blamed on Japanese companies. A Chinese American, Vincent Chen, was beaten to death. Not one of his perpetrators experienced time in jail. And so to you, Mr. Kim, on the evening or the discovery of who did this heinous crime of killing 8 people, 6 of them Asian women. A law enforcement officer decided to say the words, "This individual had a bad day, and this is what happened." I have a question as well for Mr. Kilcarney, but would you, Mr. Kim, just from your gut, just from your spirit, when you hear on national television after the murder of 6 Asian women that it had a bad day, what are your thoughts?
Thank you for your question, Representative. Well, I will tell you to start that, when I have a bad day, I think about going home, having a beer and watching a movie with my family. I don't think about going out and murdering 8 people. It says a lot about this person that when he says that he's trying to eliminate temptation from his life, instead of seeking help for himself, his way of eliminating temptation is to kill people, take a gun and shoot people. And when he talks about sexual temptation, what does it mean when he sees the manifestation of sexual temptation as an Asian female? These are 3 places all that had an association with Asian people. If this were a synagogue or a black church and someone shot up those places, would we really be asking whether this is a hate crime or not? And would we really have the burden of proof? It's really important, I think, that you highlight Vincent Chin, because the judge in the case of Vincent Chin said that his white murderers, these are not the kind of men you put in jail.
Thank you, Mr. Kim.
And it echoes directly with what Jay Baker said when he tried to downplay the crime by saying he was having a bad day. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Kilcarney, if I could get this question to you. What does the data show about the impact of anti-Asian rhetoric and violence that has on the mental health of members of the community? And then just quickly, Ms. Lee, if you would just quickly on the historical record, which we've seen in other populations like African Americans who were enslaved, that 1882 law, how does it continue to negatively impact? Mr. Kilcarney on the data very quickly, and I thank the chairman for his indulgence. I'll be finished after these questions. I thank him very kindly. Mr. Kilcarney?
Thank you so much for your question. We know that over 700 incidents included use of rhetoric against our community members. And that included virulent animosity, scapegoating, as well as anti-immigrant sentiment and racist characterization. And it has led to a 155% increase in depression and anxiety in our community members.
I thank you, Professor Lee, and let me indicate, Ms. Kilcarney, let me correct the record. Thank you so very much. I had stepped out when you were doing your testimony. Professor Lee, how does that historical
Yes, thank you.
moment?
Absolutely interconnected. When we are passing these first federal laws to single out an immigrant group for exclusion based on race, we are also instituting Jim Crow segregation. We are also continuing our wars and genocide of Indigenous Americans. White supremacy impacts all of us. It may impact us differently, but it impacts us all the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an excellent hearing. I thank you. I will commit to all of the witnesses my commitment to anti-hate legislation, specifically dealing with Asian Americans, and really all of us, your dad and others, stand together in fighting against inequality in America. We will not have it. We will not stand for it. We stand with you. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Lee, and I would ask unanimous consent to submit 60 letters and documents from civil rights groups and NGOs that were submitted today. Without objection, they're entered into the record. Mr. McClintock, I see you're with us, and would you desire any time? You're certainly afforded it.
Yeah, yes, I would. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. We seem to be confusing opposition to the Chinese government, including its actions during the coronavirus pandemic, with hostility toward Americans of Asian descent. And I find that very confusing, since many Asian Americans fled abusive governments, including and especially the Chinese communist regime. Hostility to that government is not hostility to its victims, quite the contrary. Yet that seems to be the connection that many people are making today. There are despicable racists of every color in every society. It is the baser side of human nature. But no nation has struggled harder to transcend that nature and isolate and ostracize its racists than have Americans. You know, the American founders placed principles in the Declaration of Independence that they believed would someday produce a nation of free men and women of all races and all religions, together enjoying the blessings of liberty and equal protection of our laws. Lincoln denounced any other claim as, quote, having an evil tendency, if not an evil design. The violent attacks that have been cited today against Asian Americans are heinous, they are despicable, they are inexcusable. But there are two statistics that should add some perspective to this issue. According to the FBI's Hate Crime Statistics Act report, of all 4,930 victims of reported hate crimes were motivated by race or ethnicity, 48.5% were due to anti-Black bias, 15.7% were due to anti-white bias, 14.1% were due to anti-Hispanic or Latino bias, and 4.4% were due to anti-Asian bias. What should make us all proud as Americans is the fact that Asian Americans have the highest median income of any ethnic group in America, including white Americans. Median income for Asian Americans is 38% higher than the national median. If America were such a hate-filled, discriminatory, racist society filled with animus against Asian Americans, how do you explain the remarkable success of Asian Americans in our country? Their success should bring us all together as Americans to celebrate the opportunities that our country offers to all who seek the blessings of liberty. It deeply saddens me that instead of uniting as Americans, this hearing seeks to divide us as Americans. Any racist sentiment, speech, or act needs to be vigorously condemned. But to attack our society as systemically racist, a society that has produced the freest, most prosperous, and most harmonious multiracial society in human history, well, that's an insult, and it's flat out wrong. Shakespeare reminded us that we have no such mirrors as will turn our hidden worthiness into our eye, that we might see our shadow. The protesters fighting for their freedom in Hong Kong, resisting their takeover by the Communist government of China, waved American flags as a symbol of their aspirations. Perhaps we should look to them as a mirror to appreciate our own society's hidden worthiness. And I'd ask Dr. Fall if he's still in the committee room for any thoughts he might have on the subject.
Do you yield back the rest of your time, sir?
I'd like to yield it to Dr. Fall if he's still
Okay,
there.
sure. Dr. Fall, he yielded to you.
Oh, thank you. It's Mr. Fod. I don't have my doctorate degree, but thank you. You know, I think the congressman's words were very powerful. I do agree that we're all Americans. We're all entitled. We all have our individual rights, individual liberty. No one has more or less liberty than someone else because of race. So I think what comes out of this hearing should be that we're all entitled to equality before the law, to be treated as individuals, to be treated based on our own individual aspirations, individual achievements, and individual accomplishments, and not to be discriminated against because we happen to be in a racial group that someone else might not like.
Would the congressman yield?
Exactly. Thank you.
Would the congressman yield? This is.
Yes.
Would you yield for a moment, Ms. McClintock?
Of course.
Let me express my appreciation for your interpretation. I think one of the things I would ask the gentleman to consider, 4%, but we don't want one life to be taken in the name of hatred and race discrimination or ethnicity discrimination. I think the Chin case, Mr. McClintock, where an individual was beaten to death because they thought he was Chinese when the car industry went down, and his perpetrators were not even one day in jail. because they
I
did
agree
deal
with
it.
you. Reclaiming my time, I agree with the gentlelady completely. What I think we need to be careful about is tainting our entire society with the actions, the hideous actions of a few, whatever their race, and whatever is the race of their victim.
Thank you, Mr. McClintock. I appreciate
yield back.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your comments, and you're right. We're still trying to form a more perfect union. We're now in the situation of having a second round, and the first person in the second round is me. And I'm going to yield my time to Ms. Jayapal. She'll have 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for including me in this hearing and for yielding your time. I want to start by saying some names that we all should be saying every minute of every day, and they're just a few. Delana Ashley Yan, Paul Andre Meckles, Jiajie Yan, Dao Yu Feng, Elcias Hernandez Ortiz, Julie Park, Hyunjong Park. These were people who were murdered in Georgia just a couple of days ago. And Mr. Chairman, I would just say, as an Indian immigrant woman, the first South Asian American elected to the House of Representatives, the violence and discrimination targeting the Asian American community hits very close to home. And it's been a difficult hearing, an important hearing, but a very difficult hearing for many of us. Shortly after 9/11, I founded One America, Washington State's largest immigrant rights group, initially to fight back against backlash targeting Muslim, Sikh, and South Asian communities. Back then, it was Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was murdered on September 15th, 2001 in Mesa, Arizona. He was shot 5 times by a man who just, quote, wanted to kill a Muslim. A man who said, as he was arrested, "I stand for America all the way." Mr. Chairman, there is no question that our words matter, our framing matters, and particularly as members of Congress, when we use our platforms to continue slurs that are seen in a way that encourages racist hate crimes, it is a big problem. Just recently in a committee hearing, some of my colleagues across the aisle continued to call it the China virus. I spoke up. I said that was not correct language, number one, and number two, it incited this kind of hate. And yet my colleagues continued to use that language. And now here we are continuing to see a huge surge in hate crimes and violence targeting, in particular, most recently, Asian women. I want to start with you, Professor Motomura. How does the history of racist laws that promoted distrust towards Asian Americans influence the hate we are seeing today?
Well, I mean, those influences are very profound. We start with the Chinese exclusion era. It's exclusion, as we've heard today, exclusion of Asian immigrants. Most Asian immigrants, Chinese immigrants, starting in 1882. It prevails for 60 years. It stunts the growth of the Chinese American community. And we have severe restrictions on Asian immigration, formal restrictions until 1965. I mean, I feel, as I mentioned in my testimony, just very strongly because my own family was one of the few families that managed to get to the United States during that period. And so we joined a community that really didn't exist at that time of my parents' contemporaries. And so, you know, these are things that you carry with you for your whole life. I remember a lot of the sorts of incidents that we're talking about today, having close calls and those sorts of things. This is a long time ago, but these are things that we see from those laws. I think we've seen this with regard to the ban that was imposed on majority Muslim countries that prevailed over the last 4 years. And I think that's not exactly entirely what we're talking about today, but I think it's pretty closely related. So I think that a lot of this is something that prevails over time. I mean, this is not something that is limited to a 5-year period, a 10-year period, but I think we're still seeing effects, as we've seen today, of anti-Chinese laws that took effect in 1875 and 1882.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Sinner, you have written about 9/11 and the discriminatory laws and policies against Asian American, Arab, Muslim, and Sikh communities that came after. Do you believe that there's a strategy behind demonizing these groups in times of crisis and fear?
So thank you for your comments and your question to me, Representative Jaipal. What happened after 9/11 is that the government undertook a number of dragnet immigration programs that treated entire communities as threats. So hundreds of immigrants were detained on the basis of their race and ethnicity without any individual basis for suspicion. 25 Muslim countries, their citizens were subject to special registration, fingerprinting, and interrogation. And all of this sent the message that Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities were disloyal and threatening. And the lesson here is that in times of geopolitical tension and security fears, it's especially important for the government to avoid stigmatizing entire communities because it does lead to greater violence and discrimination, both in the public sphere as well as government policy directly.
Thank you. I just want to say, I hope that my colleagues understand their words matter, and we need everyone's help in fighting back against these racist attacks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I yield back. Thank you. That concludes today's hearing. And I want to thank all of our witnesses. It was a spectacular panel, a lot of knowledge, a lot of information that was important to be dispensed. And I think we did a lot of good today. I hope so. And it brought Hawaii Five-O's theme song back to my mind, which has been playing over and over and over and over again. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. With that, the hearing is adjourned.
Savannah Guthrie. Good evening, everyone. We're about to hear from President Biden at the White House, marking 1 year since the coronavirus pandemic took hold in this country.
And it has been a year of once unimaginable loss, jobs gone, businesses closed, people isolated, and everyday life disrupted. More than 500,000 Americans dead from the virus in 1 year.
Tonight, in his first primetime address as President, Joe Biden will talk about what we've been through and what lies ahead as vaccines point the way to what we all hope will be better days to come.
He's just moments away from taking that podium. We do have a moment to turn to our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker. And Kristen, what do you expect to hear from the president tonight?
Well, Savannah, Lester, good evening. President Biden is expected to announce that he's directing states to expand eligibility for vaccines to all adults by May 1st. The question is he going to be able to follow through with that timeline? As you know, there have been some mixed messages before about timelines. The president will also say the country is going to aim for small group gatherings by July 4th. Now, it comes after the White House vowed to start sending out those $1,400 direct payments. That's, of course, a part of that sweeping relief bill. They're vowing to send them out by this weekend. Of course, that bill passed without any Republican support. Republicans saying they would have backed a smaller bill that was more targeted. GOP lawmakers arguing the bill balloons the deficit and spends too much money on non-COVID related items like the arts and climate change. A lack of bipartisanship, which could spell trouble for the rest of his agenda, Lester.
All right, Kristen Welker at the White House. Thank you. And here is the president now approaching the podium.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight, I'd like to talk to you about where we are as we mark 1 year since everything stopped because of this pandemic. A year ago, we were hit with a virus that was met with silence and spread unchecked. Denials for days, weeks, then months. That led to more deaths, more infections, more stress, and more loneliness. Photos and videos from 2019 feel like they were taken in another era. The last vacation, the last birthday with friends, the last holiday with extended family. While it was different for everyone, we all lost something, a collective suffering, a collective sacrifice, a year filled with the loss of life and the loss of living for all of us. But in the loss, we saw how much there was to gain in appreciation, respect, and gratitude. Finding light in the darkness is a very American thing to do. In fact, it may be the most American thing we do. And that's what we've done. We've seen frontline and essential workers risking their lives, sometimes losing them, to save and help others. Researchers and scientists racing for a vaccine. And so many of you, as Hemingway wrote, being strong in all the broken places. I know it's been hard. I truly know. As I've told you before, I carry a card in my pocket with the number of Americans who have died from COVID to date. It's on the back of my schedule. As of now, total deaths in America, 527,726. That's more deaths than in World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, and 9/11 combined. There were husbands, wives,